Hi, I'm Josh Knobe,
And I'm Kiley Hamlin.
and today we're going to be talking about some work that you did that was recently featured in a cover story in New York Times Magazine. So it seems like one common way of thinking about morality is that morality is something that we learn, that we acquire morality from our society or we learn it from our parents or something like this. But it seems like what your research has been suggesting is that maybe people actually have moral judgments even when they're non-linguistic infants. Even before we can speak, we actually are making some kinds of moral judgments or certain kinds of evaluations.
Yeah. So I've done quite a bit of work with my colleagues from Yale University, Karen Wynn and Paul Bloom. And what we've been looking at is the possibility that even young babies, quite young, so in the first year of life, might be able to judge individuals based on how they treat other individuals. So simply whether they're being sort of a good guy or a bad guy. And we find pretty robustly that babies seem to prefer quite young, helpful puppets, good puppets, to unhelpful puppets or bad puppets.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about the experimental paradigm that you used to show these effects.
Sure. So we have quite a few different puppet interactions that we use to test infants' preferences. But basically we have three puppet characters, one of whom has some particular goal. So we've tested things like the goal to get up to the top of a steep hill, or the goal to open up a box that has a toy inside, or the goal to get one's toy back when they drop it. And so say the protagonist puppet has this particular goal for the hill or the toy or the box. And then we show two additional puppets, one of whom always comes up and helps the puppet get its goal, so facilitates the goal being achieved, and the other one who always comes up and blocks the puppet from getting its goal. So when we're seeing this as adults, it's very clear to us who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, but we were curious as to whether preverbal infants, before they've been really taught about good guys and bad guys and how to evaluate, etc., might see it that way also. So the way that we test this is by showing them these puppet interactions a number of times and then just simply having them choose between the puppets at the end. And basically we find very strong preferences for helpful puppets over unhelpful puppets in all of the scenarios that we've tested, and starting even at 3 months of age.
So even when children are 3 months old, they're actually preferring a puppet that helps another puppet get up a hill to one that kind of blocks the puppet and prevents it from getting up the hill.
Yeah, exactly. We were actually very, very surprised by the 3-month old result. 3-month-olds are barely holding their head up very well yet. They're not sitting up on their own. They're not moving around in the world. And their vision isn't super great yet either. And yet they're able to sort of not only distinguish between these characters on the stage, but also seemingly analyze their behaviors and evaluate them based on them. So it was pretty striking result to us that this might be something that is incredibly fundamental to the way that any human, even a pre-linguistic and still sleeping most of the day kind of human, would be seeing the world.
So is there any way of telling whether this kind of judgment that it's making is really a judgment that there's something sort of good or bad about what this puppet is doing versus, say, just a feeling of liking things that help things get upwards versus disliking things that don't help?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've done a lot of additional studies in order to try to rule out some alternative explanations or even some fairly good explanations for what might actually be driving the infants' preferences in these studies. So in each one of the studies that I described with the hill and with the box and with the dropping of the toy, we have what we call an inanimate control, in which instead of the puppets pushing up or down the hill some animate creature that wanted to get up or down the hill, we have puppets who do exactly the same behaviors and bring about exactly the same outcomes, but they do it toward an inanimate object. So it doesn't seem And basically, when we have babies choose between those puppets, somebody who, say, pushed an inanimate object up a hill versus pushed one down, or opened a box with an inanimate object, or jumped on the box with an inanimate object, we don't find that babies have any preferences there. So suggesting that there's something specifically social about their evaluation, that they need to see something have a goal that is a social being, and then see that goal carried out by additional social beings, suggesting that it's not just about bringing out a particular state, like pushing something up a hill versus down a hill.
So before we can even hold our own heads up, we recognize the distinction between animate objects and inanimate objects, the idea that animate objects have goals, whereas inanimate objects don't,
right.
And in addition, the idea that there's something good about helping animate objects to achieve their goals, something bad about hindering inanimate objects from achieving these goals, and that it's sort of neither good nor bad to help or hinder objects that don't have this kind of animacy.
Right. Well, it's sort of unclear exactly how infants are seeing that latter thing. So it may be that they can identify the goal of an inanimate thing, but they don't think it's good to help or hinder that goal. Or it may be that if it's an inanimate thing, they just don't see a goal at all, and so these behaviors are just being interpreted in a completely different light. So, of course, we wouldn't think that somebody kicking a rock was a bad person, and it seems like babies don't either.
Mm-hmm. So right now what you're saying is if you compare the one that helps to the one that hinders, then children prefer the one that helps to the one that hinders. But is there any way of figuring out whether that's because they dislike the one that hinders, they like the one that helps, or they both like the one that helps and dislike the one that hinders?
Yeah, so we have neutral conditions in many of our studies in which we ask that question, whether babies' preferences for helping over hindering or helpers over hinderers is about the helper being independently positive or the hinderer being independently negative, or whether helping is just somewhat better than hindering. And we find that at 6 months of age, babies show preferences for helpers over neutral characters who haven't actually done anything to anyone else. They carry out the same actions, but they're not directed at anyone. And a neutral character also is better to babies at 6 months than an unhelpful or hindering character. So it seems like by 6 months of age, at least they have both sides of the coin. So helping is better than neutral, and neutral is better than hindering. Interestingly enough, we also have found that it seems like an aversion to hindering or hinderers might be the first thing to develop. So at 3 months of age, we find that babies seem to avoid hinderers. So they, when a hinderer is versus a helpful character, they avoid the hinderer and go for the helpful character. And when a hinderer is versus a neutral character, they avoid the hinderer and go for the neutral character. Interestingly enough, they don't yet prefer helpful to neutral at this youngest age that we've tested, this 3-month-old group.
So it seems like we first learn that harming is bad, and then only later get this idea that sort of helping is something good.
Right, exactly. Which is a sort of interesting way to think about what morality might be, at least at first, that actually the sort of negative stuff is quite salient to us and perhaps influencing our judgments more than the positive stuff.
Mm-hmm. So maybe you could talk about just a couple of the other things that you've discovered using various different kinds of variations on this paradigm.
Sure. So we have quite a few studies now that have looked at whether babies think that all helpful actions are good and all unhelpful actions are bad. For instance, as adults, we see action in context often. So we can say that that was a particularly unhelpful action, but that character somehow deserved it. So we might think of punishment as a good version or a good candidate for this. So if we see someone who was bad before being punished, we wouldn't necessarily think that the punisher was some kind of evildoer. We would think he did something appropriate. And what we're finding is that when you first show infants a good character and a bad character, and then show, say, the bad character being helped and hindered by new characters. So potentially, if you think about it like reward and punishment, then we'd have the bad character being either rewarded or punished. And in this case, it's more appropriate to punish a bad character. And what we find is that 8-month-old infants already are positively evaluating the punishers in that study. So they seem to be able to say that, yes, generally I like helping, but actually in this case, punishing is deserved. So they choose the hinderer in that particular manipulation.
So young children understand not only that there's something bad about hindering animate objects in particular, but the distinction between good and bad people, such that it's wrong to harm people who are good, but if someone is actually a nasty person, then it's okay to hinder that person.
Right, exactly. We have basically been very curious about all these contextual pieces of information that you need to take into account when you're evaluating individuals. So, of course, part of a mature morality is not just saying it's always good to hold the door open for someone. It's saying that, different people have different deserve different things, different people want different things, and being moral is being able to incorporate all of that information into what you yourself choose to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like babies are not only liking nice guys generally, but also being able to take this contextual information into account, such that in some cases they actually prefer mean guys.
Mm-hmm. And then, before we turn to thinking about what this all means, is there any further thing we should know about the pattern of the data you're observing?
Sure. Two additional studies that we've been looking at most recently is sort of taking the classic intention and outcome distinction in morality research and basically asking whether babies always use outcome, which has been the sort of classic thought about the development of morality, that at first we might be able to judge others as being bad, but it would be sort of linked necessarily to the outcomes of the actions. And so if babies saw two identical outcomes, even if the intention of the characters differed, like this guy was bad, but he meant to be good, he just ended up, having a bad accident. If the outcomes are equal, the theory has been that babies or kids even would not be able to distinguish intention in those scenarios. And actually,
maybe before we go on,
mm-hmm.
it would be helpful to just summarize kind of the classic work on this thing from the Piagetian tradition, so that people have a sense of.
Yeah. So John Piaget, one of the most famous cognitive developmentalists in history, made some very classic tests of children's moral intuitions. So he basically said, well, there are good actions that lead to good outcomes, and there are bad actions that lead to bad outcomes. But of course, morally, we take an individual's intention into account. So we don't just say what was the result of their action. We say, did they mean to do it? Did they carry out this action with the knowledge that this result would occur, etc. And so the classic task is a little boy is jumping up on the counter when he's not supposed to, and he reaches into the cabinet and breaks one teacup. And this little boy has some amount of blameworthiness that should be given to him, versus a little boy who is running into the kitchen and swings the door open and knocks over a tray with 12 teacups on it. So in the case of the boy who was in the cabinet when he shouldn't have, he only broke one teacup. And in the case of the other boy who hit the door, he broke 12. And so the intentions of the two are different. The naughty little boy in the cabinet is someone that adults would see as bad, even though he only broke one teacup. But obviously the outcome of the unintentional breaking of teacups was much worse. It was 12 teacups. Mm-hmm. And basically what Piaget found is that kids think that the accidental breaking of 12 teacups is worse than the sort of intentional, or at least naughty, breaking of one teacup. And so he used that to argue that kids couldn't distinguish between intention and outcome, and tended to just focus on the outcome of actions in order to assign blameworthiness. So that's the sort of classic task, and many studies have attempted to show that kids don't do this. But in fact, kids aren't great, it turns out, at these sort of scenarios. And if you make it very easy for them, then they can use intention. But it doesn't seem like it's something that kids do readily to these sort of scenario tasks. So with our work, we decided to give it a try with the babies, and basically we're finding that if you keep the outcome the same, so say it's always a bad outcome, but one guy intended the bad outcome and one guy first intended but failed to bring about the good outcome, that babies are going with the intention. So they seem to be able to distinguish a guy who had a good intention and brought about a bad outcome than a guy who had a bad intention and brought about a bad outcome. And the same.
So you're saying that this task that someone like Jean Piaget thought you couldn't even do as a child, you're actually saying that people can do this as infants before they can speak, when they're still having difficulties sort of with motor control, they're already able to distinguish to understand this sort of complex role of intention in judgments of blameworthiness.
Yeah, well, that's what we're finding so far. We need to do many more studies to see if we can tease apart why a baby might succeed at this, whereas a kid, and many studies have shown that kids fail at this. But yeah, basically we're showing that they're at least sensitive to it. So exactly what they're picking out is still open to interpretation. But yeah, it seems much earlier that in the first year of life, before they learn about what an intention is in terms of moral judgments, they're using it on their own to determine who's good and who's bad.
So do you have any hypotheses about how it could be that this task is being failed by much older kids in the scenario version, but is being passed by these infants?
Yeah, I mean, the one that most easily comes to my mind is that with the sort of complex verbal demands on kids, young kids, in these sort of story tasks, in which there's a lot of stuff going on, there's a lot of things to keep track of, and they're basically listening to a story. There's just much more demand on memory and on processing ability, etc., than there is when you're just simply watching an interaction sort of over and over again that has no language and nothing to listen to, just some puppet shows to watch. So we make the distinction very salient, and there's nothing to sort of remember except that, I like this guy better than that guy. So it may be that if tests could be designed for kids that were less verbal and more sort of just based on watching a little interaction or something, that kids might succeed also. But that would be up for further study.
So, I think now that we get a sense for the basic pattern of data in your study, it's worth thinking about sort of how surprising this is in the way that it kind of goes against a certain kind of conception that and I think many people had about how people acquire the capacity for moral judgment or for thinking morally. So it seems like our normal way of thinking about it is that there are certain things no one has to teach you, like, say, how to walk. We don't kind of instruct children how to walk. We think of it as being something like an instinct. But we do always instruct children in morality. We try to teach children that it's wrong to hurt other people, that it's right to help other people, and so forth. But it seems like you're suggesting that even before anyone has engaged in this kind of instruction of kids, children are already making these kinds of judgments.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you brought up we don't think we need to teach our children to walk, because of course that's very true in the West and in much of the world. So we think that there are certain things that kids need help with, like morality or like reading or things like that. And then there are certain other things that kids don't need any help with. So when they turn about 6 to 9 months, they'll start crawling on their own. And when they turn about a year, they'll start walking on their own, etc. And they don't really need much training in order to do that. It's just sort of maturational. However, there's an interesting group of people in Africa, and these folks have been shown to actually do believe that you need to teach your kid to walk. So they do all of these, what we might find to be quite surprising, exercises, physical exercises with their infants. And they, stretch their arms out, stretch their legs out, and sort of make them do sort of physical exercises in an attempt to teach them to walk or to advance them physically in a way faster than they would on their own. And inherent there is the assumption that it's something that does need to be socialized, need to be taught. And basically, it turns out that those babies actually do walk sooner and sit up sooner and crawl sooner than Western babies do. So there's something there in this group's opinion that if you do sort of socialize or practice things, that kids might get better at it. That may be true for Western children learning morality. Certainly there are things that are not going to be so obvious to a kid as perhaps, helping is good and hindering is bad. But that said, it seems to be that the more we look at and we look for what those things might be in a preverbal infant even, the more they actually seem to have on their own. So it's taking this idea that we need to really hammer down right and wrong and good and bad into our children and saying that that may very well be true for some of the details, but they might have a lot more going on already on their own without needing the teaching from us.
So are you thinking that teaching our children right and wrong is like this tribe who teaches children how to walk? That is to say, these children would have learned to walk regardless. All that the adults are doing is just kind of helping them along a little bit, making it a little bit faster. So consider now our morality. There are certain kinds of details, but there's also just this basic idea that you should be good to other people, you should not try to hurt them, you should try to help them. And we really take a lot of effort to instill this in children. Are you thinking in just the same way that if we stopped trying to instill that, kids would still pick it up? It would just take maybe a little bit longer.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting comparison because, in fact, we might think that with training a particular skill, that the training would allow it to come on sooner. But interestingly, we're finding these very, very early, seemingly pieces of knowledge or representations or something like that in babies far before we would have even thought that they would have been able to take in the appropriate kind of input that we're thinking about. So it's not like kids or babies are 6 months old and their parents are saying to them like, good, helpful stuff is good and unhelpful stuff is bad, but don't forget about the punishment stuff because when someone deserves punishment, that can be good too. Basically, those things wouldn't be sort of explicitly socialized for many years after babies are actually showing these competencies. So it's distinct from some of these other things that we might think that babies can do, and then we can help them do it faster. These are kinds of things that we think that even young children can't do. So the socialization that we're adding, we're really not starting to even think about adding it for, depending on the family, 1, 2, 3 years post when we're already showing they have this competence.
But now, it seems like there are sort of different sorts of views one might have about what's going on in these cases. The most extreme view is the one that you seem to be slightly moving toward now, the idea that we really don't need socialization at all to get this basic idea of morality. Even if we never did anything, kids would basically still develop this idea that certain things are right, certain things are wrong, and so forth. Even if their peers didn't teach them about it, even if parents and teachers never mentioned it, the whole thing would eventually kind of more or less come into place. Not the details, but this basic idea. But then there might be a much less extreme sort of view where you might say something like, what we have among these kids is something like the sprouts of goodness or the sort of core features of morality. But in order for that to evolve into something like what we see in adults as a bona fide, full-blown moral judgment, you'd really have to have these other kind of facilitating factors. Things like other kids that you can talk with, maybe parents helping you out in certain respects. But that this phenomenon that you're finding among infants isn't itself sort of enough to give us more morality as we sort of know it in adults.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the distinction there for sure. Interestingly, we've found a few things that we might not be super happy with, actually, if we found them in an adult, and we would think that if adults were doing the things that we've found that infants do, which may reflect the immaturity of their system, that actually we would be upset by that. For instance, we find that this is with my colleagues again, Karen Wynn and Paul Bloom, and also with Neha Mahajan, and we find that babies are actually basically liking those puppets who are unhelpful. So sort of like the punishment study in which they like puppets who are unhelpful towards bad guys. But in this case, they're liking puppets who are unhelpful toward simply individuals they don't like because they don't share their preferences. So other studies by Neha Mahajan and Karen Wynn have showed that babies like puppets who share their preferences over puppets who don't share their preferences. They seem to dislike those who don't share their preferences. And we find that babies actually positively evaluate unknown puppets based on them being mean to those who don't share their preferences. So certainly might be a good candidate case in which the morality or whatever it is, the social evaluation possibilities that infants are showing are not things that we would want to find in an adult. And in fact, of course, historically, we found many things like that. So simply thinking it's okay to dislike others because they're different from you. But of course, this isn't part of our modern day, at least Western morality. And so a lot of changes would have to occur there in order to decide which things do and which things do not apply to sort of my moral world. And that might be something that we need to teach babies.
So this is something like the developmental roots of the Red Sox-Yankees conflict, where, say, the typical Red Sox fan seeing something bad happen to the typical Yankees fan might feel like a slight surge of joy,
Right.
and think, well, maybe there was something really good about doing that bad thing to the Yankees fan, even if later that sort of sense of joy was inhibited. The person thought ultimately even Yankees fans shouldn't be harmed.
Right. And I think there's certainly some when we see, so if we're a Red Sox fan and we see a Yankees fan like slip on a banana, we're like, we find that to be hilarious and really funny, and we wouldn't find that to be so good if it was one of us, a Red Sox fan. But on the other hand, we don't go so far as to think that it's okay to kill someone who simply votes for the other team. Of course, I'm not saying that that's what babies are doing, but it may be that they have a harder time drawing the line in those sort of subtleties, that there's good stuff and there's bad stuff, and you're on one side or the other. And the subtleties in there where it's like you're bad because you like the Yankees, but you're still a person and you deserve to be treated well, those details might be lost, and that might be what we need to teach.
So, obviously, you didn't do the actual study with Red Sox versus Yankees fans. So how did you study these phenomena in infants?
So we developed a paradigm that had already been developed by Neha Mahajan and Karen Wynn, in which basically we simply had babies choose between two snacks, so green beans and graham crackers. And surprisingly enough, babies generally prefer graham crackers, but there are some babies, about 25%, who sort of continuously or robustly prefer green beans. But it turns out that after the baby makes their preference, we then show them one puppet preferring the thing they preferred, so say graham crackers, and the other puppet preferring the thing that they didn't prefer, say green beans. And then those puppets are presumably, if babies in fact do like puppets who are similar to them, those puppets are presumably then liked versus disliked, simply for their food preference being either the same or different from babies' food preferences. And then we would show babies similar puppet shows to what we'd shown them before, in which there's a helpful character and an unhelpful character. In this case, there's helpful and unhelpful either directed toward the shared preference puppet, the puppet that the baby likes, or the opposite preference puppet, the puppet that the baby dislikes. And what we found is that babies robustly prefer the one who's nice to the puppets that they like, but they equally robustly prefer, so really flip their preference here, the puppet who's not nice to the puppet they dislike. So they don't know anything about the target puppets except their food preference, and they don't know anything about the actor puppets accept their behaviors, and they're seemingly really shifting from liking nice guys to those they like to liking those who are mean to those they dislike.
So when we were just a few months old, we actually felt that if we liked graham crackers and someone else liked green beans, it would be good for that other person to be actively hindered in his or her goals.
Yeah, well, the description of "we thought this way" is it's hard to know exactly what's going on in their minds, but certainly their behavior is such that they're positively evaluating those who do that, even over those who are just generally nice across the board.
Mm-hmm. So you said earlier that what we see arising already in infants is that aspect of morality which is in some sense the most fundamental one. So are you thinking that in some way, deep within the two of us, for example, there's also some kind of feeling that those who like green beans should be hindered?
Well, yes. I mean, I think back to the presidential elections of the last 10 years or so, and finding out that someone disagrees with you on things about what you like and what you dislike, especially politically, but even finding out that you and your friend both have a crazy obsession with Brussels sprouts or something, could bring people together and split people apart. So I might find that I really, like talking to someone and they were a cool person, and then I find out that their political beliefs are different from mine, and it doesn't matter what they act like or how we interact. I simply don't like them. And so I think that there's certainly things like that going on in adults, and I think that at different times in history, those things have been more or less okay, and in different domains, more or less okay to act on. But certainly, I think emotionally, at least, those processes are still happening.
But maybe the presidential election is a very special case, because it's not just that different people had different preferences, it's that other people's preferences were in some way transforming what would happen in our government. So if I discover that someone had a different preference about what happened in the presidential election, it's not just that that person prefers something different from me, it's that that person is changing what will be the government of our nation.
Yeah.
But suppose I just learn that there's certain person living in Bangladesh who has extremely different preferences from me. All of the foods that I like, this person doesn't like, but all the foods this person likes, I don't like. And similarly, all the bands that I really like, this person thinks that they're terrible, and he likes a completely different kind of music. Having learned all that, I don't feel like intuitively that I would have any preference that this person be hindered in his goals. In fact, I just have the sense that I think people should be nice to this person.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you brought up music taste, because I was going to use that as a point for my side. In that, I think when people's music tastes differ, when I hear that someone, say likes country music, or apologies to everyone out there who likes country music, but there's something fundamental I feel about that person that I learn about them based on their preferences. So sort of liking something it means something on the inside, and it's a signal to sort of greater meaning about whether I might like that person on the inside. That said, of course, I don't necessarily want these individuals to be harmed. But a very interesting study that came out this year showed that, to go back to the Yankees Red Sox example, that actually the reward centers of our brains are activating when we see outgroup members, in terms of sports teams, being punished or being harmed in some way. So even if sort of consciously we don't think that we're supporting it, it may be that there's some part of us, in this case maybe the reward centers of our brain, that are liking it when our different people from us, those who don't share our preferences, are being harmed.
So you're thinking that this person I've just described, the person who has exactly the opposite preferences that I do, there he is, living in Bangladesh, not impacting me at all, but he just hates all of the indie rock music I cherish so much. Then, if he's trying to get up the stairs and someone gets in his way and then he ends up slipping a little bit, there's some part of me that will exult in this?
Well, it's an interesting question. So one way the process might work is that it's not that we necessarily really want the punishment to occur. We don't want the guy who doesn't share our preference to get pushed down the stairs. But if we don't know anything about the individuals that are treating him in particular ways, a really good method of choosing who to hang out with is based on these sort of very basic ideas that friends of my friends are my friends, and enemies of my enemies are my friends. So perhaps what infants are doing in these cases are saying that I don't like that guy. That guy is being mean to him, so he must not like him either. So I must like the mean guy. So it may be that infants are taking these behaviors as evidence of whether they should like that character based on whether they share opinions or not. So exactly what is going on in terms of the why infants are positively evaluating these characters may be because they really actually want the guy to get hurt, or it may be because they think something positively about someone who agrees with them that that other guy sucks or something like that.
So, maybe the issue that we're getting at here has to do with fundamentally what's going on in development, what sort of the process of development is like. So one view, and this is the view you seem to be proposing, is that when we're very young, we prefer for something bad to happen to those who like green beans when we like graham crackers, and that always remains within our minds, even until adulthood. It's just that we eventually acquire something else, this kind of capacity to inhibit that initial intuition and to sort of force that down so that we instead, on the whole, say that it would be better for the green bean likers to be treated well. And then the other possible view, a very different one from that one, would be that development involves some process of actually changing, so that when we're young, we have this feeling of preferring for something bad to happen to those who like green beans. But then as we get older, something deeply different starts to take place, such that we actually think there's something bad about harming, say, the green bean lovers, and we don't have any kind of feeling of preferring that something good happens to them. So are you thinking there's something sort of right about this first picture, that this initial kind of intuition we have as infants is with us sort of throughout our whole lifetime?
I do. I think it is with us throughout our lives. I think there's a lot of evidence on the historical record that this kind of thing happens way too much. I think that we know our moral teaching tells us that it's not okay to simply dislike someone because they differ in opinion from you, but there are certainly opinions that differences of opinion that today are still causing terrible strife throughout our world. So yes, green beans is not a very important opinion, but certainly no one would argue that people don't think one's theistic beliefs, etc., would not be an opinion, a difference of opinion that would cause people to think that someone deserved serious harm. So I don't think adults secretly support knocking the guy down the stairs who likes green beans. On the other hand, this process might very much be there in adults. Perhaps what we're doing is learning which situations it's okay to apply it to and which situations it isn't. But that doesn't mean that the sort of fundamental stuff underlying these things across all situations isn't there from the beginning, and that it's not based on that throughout.
As I start considering these cases of differing preferences, I find myself having the intuition that it's somehow this childlike intuition I'm having only applies to people who are relatively similar to me. So if there were someone else here in our cognitive science program who differed from me on some very subtle point about the nature of some certain kinds of cognitive processes, maybe I would have this feeling of animosity that I would have to suppress and sort of inhibit in favor of the idea that, of course, all people should be treated well. But now, by contrast, if there was someone in Tibet thinking about these same questions, but, say, from a Buddhist perspective, and having radically different views about every aspect of them, then I wouldn't feel any animosity toward that person. At least I have the intuition that I wouldn't have an initial feeling of wanting to suppress that radically different view, and then having to inhibit that, but I wouldn't even have the initial feeling in the first place.
Yeah, and it may be that makes perfect sense if we can think about it being sort of a an infantile kind of system, in that those who you are needing to interact with on a daily basis, potentially, or ever again, might be the ones who you find these very subtle differences to be offensive. Whereas those who are sort of outside of what people have called the moral circle might not sort of generate such negative feeling and might not be applicable to this particular judgment.
Oh, so you're saying that if I find that someone is very tolerant, then, of differences with me, so this person seems very tolerant of all the ways in which the two of us differ, I should feel that that person is thereby sort of treating me as an outcast, as like an outgroup member.
If they are sensitive to the way people sorry, I missed that.
Oh, so suppose I come across someone who's really deeply different from me, has completely opposite views from me, but seems extremely tolerant of these differences, and seems to have no problem at all with the idea that I'm differing from this person in all of these ways. In an odd way, it seems like you're suggesting I should feel insulted, because if this person really saw me as kind of an in-group member, as part of his or her own tribe, then she'd be much more intolerant.
Right. That's a really interesting prediction. Yeah. Right. So we should see it that if someone doesn't find my differences from them offensive, it's that they don't care about me at all.
So it seems like we're finding now that a lot of the things we really cherish about human beings are present even in infancy, but also the dark side of human nature, this tendency to denigrate outgroup members, to hope that bad things happen to people who are different from us. This too seems to be present even from a really young age. So sort of in conclusion, is there any sort of message that we should be taking away from these kinds of findings?
Well, I think the first is that babies have a lot of judgments going on their own, and they're judging you way before you think they are. But in terms of the socialization of the ways in which you would hope that a child would turn out, I think that most parents are doing exactly the right thing, and somehow we're going from what is perhaps an infantile, sort of less ideal system, what we might think of as, in fact, less moral, but in other ways, it seems quite moral, as in that it judges others for their behaviors and their social interactions and things like that. That those, socializing those things might be help along the way, but not be required or not be required at least to start the system going.
Okay, so on that note, thank you so much, Kylie.
Thank you.